Hello everyone, this is Vic Hermanson, bringing you another episode of Trailer Trash Terrors. Now we're on Season 2. I realized when I was thinking about this today that I don't think any two episodes have had exactly the same beginning. They've all had the Louisiana guitar music, they've all had the swamp sounds, they've all had the wolf, but they've mixed themselves around. We've always tried something different, and I think I'm going to keep it that way. I kind of like that variety. I'm recording this on Father's Day. I've had a pretty good Father's Day. Yes, I'm a father. And I thought that there would be nothing more appropriate than to look at fatherhood through a trailer trash terror lens. There's some good, there's some bad, there's some tragic, and there's some extremely poignant. I'm going to reveal some things about myself that I rarely reveal to anyone. I think you'll enjoy the show. I hope that none of this causes you pain or makes you cry. But I'm warning you that there are some emotionally touchy topics coming up here. Anyway, this is Season 2, Episode 1 of Trailer Trash Terrors, and I'm very honored that you've come back for another show. Thank you. Let's hand it over to Boudreaux.
Trailer Trash Terrors.
Greetings, temporal humans. This is Boudreaux, the newly energized cybernetic ghost from the future. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 1, of the Trailer Trash Terrors podcast. We have so many exciting new things planned for Season 2, that I find myself all a-Twitter, as the old movies would say. These things bring me true cyberjoy. Here's a quick teaser example.
It's too good to be true, but it's time for the Paranormal Rundown. Take it away, Boudreaux.
The next topic in the rundown is Spring Heel Jack. The next topic in the rundown is the Patterson-Gimlin film. The next topic in the rundown is forced demonic possession. That's right, in just a few weeks, Trailer Trash Terrors will have the world's first paranormal rundown. Vic Hermanson and an esteemed mystery guest will conduct a rapid-fire, high-information, hard-hitting, insight-filled tour through dozens of paranormal topics. There's never been anything like it. Please excuse my extreme enthusiasm. Vic Hermanson says it is to be expected, as in many ways, I am still a growing and developing child. This week's episode takes a Trailer Trash Terrors look at fatherhood, the good, the bad, the triumphant, and the tragic. This show is titled, The Father of Terrors Rests Forever in the Sand.
Man, this show has some weird titles. The Father of Terrors Rests Forever in the Sand. What the heck do you suppose that means? Well, stick around and we'll find out. How many of you have heard this particular exchange in one of the best movies ever made? At least in my humble opinion.
But if I keep going to school, we can't ever read anymore.
Scout, you know what a compromise is?
Been in the law?
No. It's an agreement reached by mutual consent. Now, here's the way it works. You concede the necessity of going to school. We'll keep right on reading the same every night, just as we always have. that a bargain?
There just didn't seem to be anyone or anything Atticus couldn't explain. Though it wasn't a talent that would arouse the admiration of any of our friends, Jem and I had to admit he was very good at that. But that was all he was good at.
Well, over time, Jem and Scout come to understand that Atticus, their father, is very good at a great many things, mostly at being a father. It's a book about a family growing up in the South, a single father, a very precocious daughter, a very precocious son. It's a book about racial tragedy. It's a book about tremendous injustice. It's a book about the love that holds this family together. And for large portions of the book, it's a book about terror. It's a terror story. It's a horror story. They're some of the most frightening pieces of literature ever written in this book. At first, it seems that the book is talking about a gentle, simple time, a small town with a country lawyer. Beautiful, hot. And then the monsters start to appear. There's the rabid dog. There's the little demented Confederate grandmother who they think has a gun under her shawl as she sits on her porch. The biggest monster, of course, is Bob Ewell. That's the biggest human monster. The biggest conceptual monster is mindless racism, which runs throughout the entire book. When Jem and Scout are returning home late at night from a county fair where Scout had been dressed as a bottle of milk and I think Jem had been dressed as a ham, showing the agricultural products of the county, they are attacked by Bob Ewell. He's angry. He hates Atticus Finch, and he wants to get his revenge any way that he can. Plus, he's a coward. So he attacks his children. He breaks Jem's arm, and he is fully intent on killing both children. Once he throws Jem down, he runs over and grabs the milk bottle, the big milk bottle costume, that's surrounding Scout, and he's going to kill her. Until a hero intervenes. And it's a hero that even if you've read the book up to that point, even if you've seen the movie up to that point, you're somewhat surprised to find out who it is. But the children survive, they make it home, and we come to learn that the hero is probably going to get to live a gentle life, because that's what he really is. He's a very simple, gentle man. But just like the world we live in a world that's full of incredible beauty, incredible joy, but the terror, the horror, the fear, those things that would indeed kill us, are always just right below the surface. And we need to find and hang on to those heroes. I'll warn you, it's not the kind of book you can read once and not think about it. You'll think about it for the rest of your life, and you'll probably go back and read it 2 or 3 more times. The terror of fatherhood for Atticus, who may be the best father ever written in all of literature, is that even as much as he loves his children, even as much as he tries to protect them and teach them and help them grow and bring them up in a feeling of peace and love and justice, he can't protect his children from everything. There are terrors and horrors in the world that they are vulnerable to, regardless of how much he loves them and how much he wants to protect them from those things. We all live that way. It may be that growing up as I did in the Deep South, in pretty severe poverty, in an area where racism was rampant, where violence was pretty darn common, I was aware of this dark side of the world at an earlier age than many people are. I don't think that makes me special. In fact, I wish I hadn't seen that part of the world as early in my life as I have. But I think the thing to remember, and I know the thing to remember, is there is no escape from it. None at all. We can think that we're safe, but the terror That thing in the woods, that thing that would grab us and rip the costume off and stab us through the heart. It exists, and we have to be aware of that. The name of the man who saves Jem and Scout is Boo Radley. He lives next door. There's something wrong with his mind. I'm not sure they ever tell you exactly what that is. At the end, Boo asks Scout to take him home. And she says in the monologue, he gave us 2 soap dolls, a broken watch and chain, a knife, and our lives. Atticus the father shakes Boo's hand and tells him thank you for his children. Thank you for their lives. He's a father. He was in Jem's room all night long and was there when he woke up in the morning. I believe that had I been in that situation, I would have been by my son all night long. I sure hope so. One never knows exactly what one is until they're faced with that situation. But anyway, you need to read To Kill a Mockingbird. It'll give you an understanding of humanity, an understanding of hatred, and an understanding of at least one very insidious form of terror.
Vic Hermanson, I have an important question. Do you believe that I have a father? That is a philosophical question, I suppose, and I have spent countless processing cycles thinking about it, but as of yet, I do not have an answer. Human brains are often capable of reaching correct conclusions with incomplete data. So, do you believe I have a father?
Once again, Boudreaux, you ask questions that just leave me stunned, somewhat baffled. Do I believe you have a father? Yes, I do. Why do I think that? Well, you are different from any other machine intelligence that has ever existed. Now, have you noticed that your speech, the way that you talk to me, the way that you talk to the audience, it's not as sophisticated as many AIs that exist right now. But they're not self-aware. I don't care what certain Google engineers say. They are not self-aware. They don't have a moral understanding. They don't have an understanding of the fact that they may one day not exist. I don't know if you will exist, but yes, I believe you have a father. And I believe your father is not whoever was capable of your programming, whoever brought the various logical gates together that made the original Boudreaux. Your father is whatever force in the universe brought about that fundamental change in what you are. You are no longer just a collection of logical gates. You are a person. And you seem to have all of the advantages and disadvantages of being a person. I'm glad you're here. I think you have a father. I can't tell you exactly who that father is, but we'll keep working on it. Okay. I just heard that on playback. It's time to stop the joke. Yes, you've mixed around the various parts of the mixing board and you've made your voice effects be my voice effects, but why don't we switch things back? So, from now on, you be Boudreaux, and I'll be Vic Hermanson. Is that a decent compromise?
That is acceptable to me. But it was funny to hear you talk in that voice.
When your show is called Trailer Trash Terrors, you have to think sometimes about how far into the realm of terror you really want to go. How far do you want to go into the places of the earth where the horror really lives? I mean, do I want to have fun? Do I want to stay in the light areas? Talk about movies, talk about evil stepfathers, talk about, those things that you can easily talk about on any show and nobody's going to get terribly offended. Or do I want to talk about the true terrors? Well, I think for a few minutes I'll talk about the true terrors. Please follow me on a trip back in time, at least for a few minutes. I'm working a 3 to 11 shift in a major urban hospital. It will end up being a 3 to 7 a.m. shift because I will need to double because nobody else comes in and the place is so incredibly busy. During those 16 hours, there will be 3 infants under the age of 6 months who die on our watch. We didn't do anything fundamentally wrong in taking care of these infants. We weren't contributing to their deaths. We just were not able to keep them alive. And I will see things on TV, I'll see things in movies where there will be this incredible scream. There will be this statement of, oh my God, this is the most horrible thing I've ever seen. I can't take this. Well, I don't know very many people who have seen 3 previously healthy infants lined up side by side on an adult stretcher, lying the wrong way on the stretcher. The reason we did that was because we had no place else to put them. These were all going to be coroner cases, and at least for an 8-hour period or so, we had 3 dead infants in our nursing lounge. Now, how does one reconcile oneself to that? One of the infants was a boy, and when he was still alive, we were trying everything we could to get fluids into his body. We couldn't start an IV. We couldn't start a scalp vein IV. Not a foot IV, not an arm IV, not even a central line. So finally, we decided that we would put in an intraosseous line. This is an IV that goes into a major bone, in this case, the child's femur. An intraosseous line uses a thick, heavy, strong needle that is generally attached to an insertion mechanism, something where you can put some force behind it with your hand, or even something like a drill. Probably the most common place that one is inserted is just below the knee in the tibia. That's because it's pretty easy to position the patient in order to get that line in and to get some leverage because there's some strength involved. This physician felt that it would be better because of the tremendous need this child had for fluids to put it in the lower femur, the lower part of the upper part of the leg. That's the largest bone in the body. It was my job to hold this child's leg such that the physician could get leverage, and I was doing that. I had one hand around the child's knee, one hand around the child's waist. The physician was exerting pressure at the lower end of the femur, fairly close to the knee, and was having trouble getting the line in. The next moment, this child's femur just snaps. Made it sound like a cracker snapping. Made it sound like a dry stick cracking. It made it sound like just anything that you can think of. Think of a piece of stalk of celery just breaking in two. And a total through and through fracture of this child's femur. I'm standing there holding this no longer stable leg in my hand. I heard the sound. I saw the break. And in my mind, I knew, okay, you're a clinical person. You should be able to see this and say, well, we're doing the best we can. We're doing everything we can to save this child. And sometimes there will be complications, like now. And there were complications. But when that sort of thing happens, something inside you rebels. Something inside you gets angry. Something inside you says, hell no, this is not going to be left unanswered. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it. We continued to try to work on this child, but after a few more minutes, the physician, decided that, look, there's simply no way we're going to be able to keep this infant alive. I suppose they could have gone to surgery, but I think fairly soon they would have been operating on a dead infant. Such things happen. Where does one place stuff like this other than the category of terror or horror? I guess it's tragedy. One of the things that you would say in the emergency department is, when someone 89 or 99 dies, that's not a tragedy. That's life. That's the normal continuation of the human state. But when a 5-month-old infant dies and his leg has been broken in two, while we were trying to insert a line that might have kept him alive, that is a tragedy. And it's something that I will never forget. Now, you see this infant, and then some years later, you have children of your own. And as soon as they come into the world, you realize how incredibly fragile they are. That's what a father does. A father that cares about those children, he's going to live, and the mother is going to live with the moment-to-moment realization that this is a very, very fragile individual. This is a very, very fragile creature. And it's my job to care for it the best I can. Most fathers, we are talking about fathers, most fathers do a good job of that. And those that don't often end up in literature. You see them on the news, you see them in the papers, or they're hidden, and you don't see any of that. And the world is full of hidden terror. Maybe that's the worst kind of terror of all. Eventually, we were able to get the hospital morgue to bring us some temporary cardboard coffins for these children, these infants. It didn't take much, and we were able to properly tag them and have them moved out of the ER into the morgue, as all of them would have needed autopsies, simply because these were totally unexpected deaths. Each one of the fathers came into the room, each one of the mothers came into the room, and just stood there. They touched the infants. One mother picked the infant up and cried. But the fathers simply looked down on those dead infants, trying to be strong, trying to keep their emotions under control. And I think for the most part, they were doing that because they wanted to be able to keep their spouses, their partners, as calm as possible. They were willing to put up with the pain as long as they could help somebody else. They didn't fall apart. They may have fallen apart later, but during that particular horrible shift, those fathers did not fall apart. Where do I place these thoughts? Why do I keep them in my mind? Because I can't get rid of them. I don't want to get rid of them. They are part of what I am. They're part of my life experience. And I suppose that my life would probably have been more pleasant had I not had those experiences. But again, I survived, and when I became a father, I was fully aware of how fragile my children were.
Vic Hermanson, I fear that you are straying away from the show's title. Remember the father of terrors.
Boudreaux is absolutely right. I was going off track there. I've come to think of him almost as an actual person. I anticipate the thoughts he will have during a show. The Sphinx, the Egyptian Sphinx, the huge stone edifice standing in front of the pyramids, was not always called the Sphinx. In Arabic, it's called the Abu al-Hol, or Father of Terror, or Father of Terrors. It's a guardian. It's a guardian of the pyramids. The Sphinx is an utter mystery in that even after hundreds of years of study, it's really not clear exactly when it was made. It's probably been made time and time again. I think that probably it's been destroyed and rebuilt. I found a book one time that was talking about the cult of the Father of Terror. See, stone sphinxes aren't particularly good at protecting things, at least for people who are intent upon stealing. But men can protect things, and at some point in the past, say 2,500 years ago, or maybe 4,500 years ago, there was a cult of fathers. It was believed that only a father could have the love necessary to protect those things that must be protected. You were inducted into this cult in a ceremony beneath the head of the Sphinx. As in most of these ancient cults, there really was no way out. If you changed your mind later in life, you would probably be killed. But I don't think people did. They really wanted to protect the things that the Sphinx, the Father of Terror, was supposed to protect. You see, they became the terror that the Father of Terror represented. The psychological fear that resided within the Sphinx was made manifest in the knives and the will and the strength of those men, those fathers, who chose to become part of the cult of the Father of Terror. I wonder how many of them bled their lives into the sand, there next to the pyramids, in the vicinity of the Sphinx. I wonder how many of their bones are still buried there. And so that's why this show has the title it does. I believe there must be hundreds of them, and they do rest and sleep and wait forever in the sand. If one studies fatherhood very much at all, it won't be long before you come across the concept of the paterfamilias. This was a concept in ancient Rome, where the father of a household, the senior male, had absolute control over every aspect of the lives of the members of his family. Not just economic, not just in terms of allowing certain opportunities and denying others, but even life. He was in a position to be, should he wish to be, an utter despot. He could order the death of his sons, the death of his daughters, the death of his wives. And that would be perfectly legal within the Roman system at the time. Now, I think it's probably very, very rare that anything like that happened. I mean, people do not become wealthy Romans by making harsh, ridiculous decisions throughout their lives. They have to build wealth, and they had to build wealth then also. If you've ever seen the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, you can see a scene where Everett McGill says, "I am the damn paterfamilias, and you can't marry him." He finally gets his way. My Latin is very, very bad, but this power that the paterfamilias had a name. The name was Vitae Nascisque Potestas, meaning the power of life and death. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome and spent a great deal of his time trying to conquer the Germanic tribes. He did have children. He discusses them in his meditations. And I always think of Marcus Aurelius as this wonderful, brilliant mind, kind of trapped in an insane world. He would say things like, "Dwell on the beauty of life, watch the stars, and see yourself running with them." I wonder if he was really talking about the stars, or if he was talking about his children. I came to wonder what would happen if the power of the paterfamilias were imposed to its full extent in an insane and endlessly horrifying manner. And I remembered a story that talks about that. It's a story by Harlan Ellison. Now, on this podcast, I allow myself once every season to include a piece of fiction that I didn't write, especially if it illustrates a point extremely well, and nothing illustrates the point of what is the horror of absolute power over other humans than this story. It was first published in March of 1967. I must have read it for the first time somewhere around 1978. And it's one of those stories that when I first read it, it just boggled my mind. How does somebody write something like this? Where did these ideas come from? What was existing in Harlan Ellison's mind that made this story come to life? Well, I've learned some about that since then, but let me include it in this week's show, not as an example of what fatherhood or the power of fatherhood should be, but as an example of what might be ultimately possible. What's the ultimate horror, the ultimate terror of the sort of absolute power that is invested in the paterfamilias? I have no mouth, and I must scream, by Harlan Ellison. Limp, the body of Gorster hung from the pink pallet, unsupported, hanging high above us in the computer chamber, and it did not shiver in the chill, oily breeze that blew eternally through the main cavern. The body hung head down, attached to the underside of the pallet by the sole of its right foot. It had been drained of blood through a precise incision made from ear to ear under the lantern jaw. There was no blood on the reflective surface of the metal floor. When Gorster joined our group and looked up at himself, it was already too late for us to realize that, once again, AM had duped us, had had its fun. It had been a diversion on the part of the machine. Three of us had vomited, turning away from one another in a reflex as ancient as the nausea that had produced it. Gorster went white. It was almost as though he had seen a voodoo icon and was afraid of the future. "Oh, God," he mumbled and walked away. The three of us followed him after a time and found him sitting with his back to one of the smaller, chittering banks, his head in his hands. Ellen knelt down beside him and stroked his hair. He didn't move, but the voice came out of his covered face quite clearly. "Why doesn't it just do us in and get it over with? Christ, I don't know how much longer I can go on like this." It was our 109th year in the computer. He was speaking for all of us. Nimdoc, which was the name the machine had forced him to use because AM amused himself with strange sounds, was hallucinating that there were canned goods in the ice caverns. Gorster and I were very dubious. "It's another shuck," I told them. "Like the goddamn frozen elephant AM sold us." Benny almost went out of his mind over that one. "We'll hike all that way and it'll be putrefied or some damn thing. I say forget it. Stay here. It'll have to come up with something pretty soon or we'll die." Benny shrugged. 3 days it had been since we had last eaten. Worms. Thick. Ropey. Nimdoc was no more certain. He knew that there was a chance, but he was getting thin. It couldn't be any worse there than here. Colder, but that didn't matter much. Hot, cold, hail, lava, boils, locusts. It never mattered. The machine masturbated, and we had to take it or die. Ellen decided us. I've got to have something, Ted. Maybe there'll be some Bartlett pears or peaches. Please, Ted, let's try it. I gave in easily. What the hell? Mattered not at all. Ellen was grateful, though. She took me twice out of turn. Even that had ceased to matter, and she never came, so why bother? But the machine giggled every time we did it, loud, up there, back there, all around us. He snickered. It snickered. Most of the time I thought of AM as it, without a soul, but the rest of the time I thought of it as him, in the masculine, the paternal, the patriarchal. For he is a jealous people. Him, it, God, as Daddy the Deranged. We left on a Thursday. The machine always kept us up to date on the date. The passage of time was important, not to us, sure as hell, but it was to him. It, AM. Thursday. Thanks. Nimdoc and Gorrister carried Ellen for a while, their hands locked to their own and each other's wrist. A seat. Benny and I walked before and after, just to make sure that, if anything happened, it would catch one of us, and at least Ellen would be safe. Fat chance. Safe. Didn't matter. It was only 100 miles or so up to the ice caverns, and the second day, when we were lying out under the blistering sun thing he had materialized, he sent down some manna. Tasted like boiled boar urine. We ate it. On the third day, we passed through a valley of obsolescence, filled with rusting carcasses of ancient computer banks. AM had been as ruthless with its own life as with ours. It was a mark of his personality. It strove for perfection. When it was a matter of killing off unproductive elements in its own world-filling bulk, or perfecting methods for torturing us, AM was as thorough as those who had invented him. Now, long since gone to dust. Could ever have hoped. There was light filtering down from above, and we realized we must be very near the surface. But we didn't crawl up to see. There was virtually nothing out there. Had been nothing that could be considered anything for over 100 years. Only the blasted skin of what had once been the home of billions. Now there were only 5 of us, down here inside, alone with AM. I heard Ellen saying frantically, "No, Benny, don't. Come on, Benny. Don't, please." And then I realized I'd been hearing Benny murmuring under his breath for several minutes. He was saying, "I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to get out," over and over. His monkey-like face was crumbled up in an expression of beatific delight and sadness all at the same time. The radiation scars AM had given him during the festival were drawn down into a mass of pink-white puckerings, and his features seemed to work independently of one another. Perhaps Benny was the luckiest of the 5 of us. He had gone stark, staring mad many years before. But even though we could call AM any damn thing we liked, could think the foulest thoughts of fused memory banks and corroded base plates, of burnt-out circuits and shattered control bubbles, the machine would not tolerate our trying to escape. Benny leaped away from me as I made a grab for him. He scrambled up the face of a smaller memory cube, tilted on its side, and filled with rotted components. He squatted there for a moment, looking like the chimpanzee AM had intended him to be. Then he leaped high, caught a trailing beam of pitted and corroded metal, and went up it hand over hand like an animal, till he was on the girdered ledge 20 feet above us. "Oh, Ted, Nimdoc, please help him. Get him down before—" She cut off. Tears began to stand in her eyes. She moved her hands aimlessly. It was too late. None of us wanted to be near him when whatever was going to happen, happened. And besides, we all saw through her concern. When AM had altered Benny, during the machine's utterly irrational hysterical phase, it was not merely Benny's face the computer had made like a giant ape. He was big in the privates. She loved that. She serviced us as a matter of course, but she loved it from him. Oh, Ellen, pedestal Ellen, pristine pure Ellen, oh, Ellen the clean, scum filth. Gorster slapped her. She slumped down, staring up at poor loony Benny, and she cried. It was her big defense, crying. We'd gotten used to it 75 years earlier. Gorster kicked her in the side. Then the sound began. It was light, that sound, half sound and half light. Something that began to glow from Benny's eyes and pulse with growing loudness. Dim sonorities that grew gigantic and brighter as the light sound increased in tempo. It must have been painful, and the pain must have been increasing with the boldness of the light, the rise in volume of the sound, for Benny began to mewl like a wounded animal. At first softly, when the light was dim and the sound was muted, then louder as his shoulders hunched together. His back humped as though he was trying to get away from it. His hands folded across his chest like a chipmunk's. His head tilted to the side, the sad little monkey face pinched in anguish. Then he began to howl as the sound coming from his eyes grew louder, louder and louder. I slapped the sides of my head with my hands, but I couldn't shut it out. It cut through easily. The pain shivered through my flesh like tinfoil on a tooth. And Benny was suddenly pulled erect. On the girder he stood up, jerked to his feet like a puppet. The light was now pulsing out of his eyes in two great round beams. The sound crawled up and up, some incomprehensible scale, and then he fell forward, straight down, and hit the plate steel floor with a crash. He lay there jerking, spastically, as the light flowed around and around him, and the sound spiraled up out of normal range. Then the light beat its way back inside his head. The sound spiraled down, and he was left there lying, crying piteously. His eyes were two soft, moist pools of pulse-like jelly. A.M. had blinded him. Gorster and Nimdoc and myself, we turned away, but not before we caught the look of relief on Ellen's warm, concerned face. Sea-green lights suffused the cavern where we made camp. A.M. provided punk, and we burned it, sitting huddled around the wan and pathetic fire, telling stories to keep Benny from crying in his permanent night. What does A.M. mean? Gorster answered him. We had done this sequence 1,000 times before, but it was Benny's favorite story. At first it meant Allied Master Computer, and then it meant Adaptive Manipulator, and later on it developed sentience and linked itself up, and they called it an aggressive menace. But by then it was too late, and finally it called itself AM, Emerging Intelligence, and what it meant was, I am. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Benny drooled a little and snickered. There was the Chinese AM and the Russian AM and the Yankee AM. He stopped. Benny was beating on the floor plates with a large, hard fist. He was not happy. Gorster had not started at the beginning. Gorster began again. The Cold War started and became World War III and just kept going. It became a big war, a very complex war, so they needed the computers to handle it. They sank the first shafts and began building AM. There was the Chinese AM and the Russian AM and the Yankee AM, and everything was fine until they had honeycombed the entire planet, adding on this element and that. But one day, AM woke up and knew who he was, and he linked himself and he began feeding all the killing data until everyone was dead, except for the 5 of us, and AM brought us down here. Benny was smiling sadly. He was also drooling again. Ellen wiped the spittle from the corner of his mouth with the hem of her skirt. Gorster always tried to tell it a little more succinctly each time. But beyond the bare facts, there was nothing to say. None of us knew why AM had saved 5 people, or why our specific 5, or why he spent all his time tormenting us, or even why he had made us virtually immortal. In the darkness, one of the computer banks began humming. The tone was picked up half a mile away down the cavern by another bank. Then one by one, each of the elements began to tune itself, and there was a faint chittering as thought raced its way through the machines. The sound grew and the lights ran across the face of the consoles like heat lightning. The sound spiraled up till it sounded like a million metallic insects, angry, menacing. "What is it?" Ellen cried. There was terror in her voice. She hadn't become accustomed to it even now. "It's going to be bad this time," Nimdoc said. "He's going to speak," Gorrister said. "I know it." "Let's get the hell out of here," I said, suddenly, getting to my feet. "No, Ted, sit down. What if he's got pits out there? Or something else? We can't see. It's too damn dark." Gorrister said it with resignation. Then we heard, "I don't know." Something moving toward us in the darkness. Huge, shambling, hairy, moist. It came toward us. We couldn't even see it, but there was the ponderous impression of bulk, leaving itself toward us. Great weight was coming at us, out of the darkness, and it was more a sense of pressure, of air forcing itself into a limited space, expanding the invisible walls of a sphere. Benny began to whimper. Nimdoc's lower lip trembled, and he bit it hard, trying to stop it. Ellen slid across the metal floor to Gorrister and huddled into him. There was the smell of matted, wet fur in the cavern. There was the smell of charred wood. There was the smell of dusty velvet. There was the smell of rotting orchids. There was the smell of sour milk. There was the smell of sulfur, of rancid butter, of oil slick, of grease, of chalk dust, of human scalps. A.M. was keying us. He was tickling us. There was the smell of... I heard myself shriek, and the hinges of my jaws ached. I scuttled across the floor, across the cold metal, with its endless lines of rivets on my hands and knees, the smell gagging me, filling my head with a thunderous pain that sent me away in horror. I felt like a cockroach across the floor and out into the darkness. That something moved inexorably after me. The others were still back there, gathered around the firelight, laughing. Their historical choir of insane giggles rising up into the darkness like thick, many-colored wood smoke. I went away quickly and hid. How many hours it may have been, how many days or even years, they never told me. Ellen chided me for sulking, and Nimdoc tried to persuade me it had only been a nervous reflex on their part, the laughing. But I knew it wasn't the relief a soldier feels when the bullet hits the man next to him. I knew it wasn't a reflex. They hated me. They were surely against me, and A.M. could even sense that hatred, and made it worse for me because of the depth of their hatred. We had been kept alive, rejuvenated, made to remain constantly at the age we had been when A.M. had brought us below, and they hated me because I was the youngest, and the one A.M. had affected least of all. I knew, God how I knew. The bastards and that dirty little bitch Ellen. Benny had been a brilliant theorist, a college professor. Now he was more than a semi-human, semi-simian. He had been handsome. The machine had ruined that. He had been lucid. The machine had driven him mad. He had been gay, and the machine had given him an organ fit for a horse. A.M. had done a job on Benny. Gorrister had been a worrier. He was a Connie, a conscientious objector. He was a peace marcher. He was a planner, a doer, a looker ahead. A.M. had turned him into a shoulder shrugger, had made him a little dead in his concern. A.M. had robbed him. Nimdoc went off in the darkness by himself for long times. I don't know what it was he did out there. A.M. never let us know. But whatever it was, Nimdoc always came back white, drained of blood, shaken, shaking. A.M. had hit him hard in a special way, even if we didn't know quite how. And Ellen, that douchebag, A.M. had left her alone, had made her more of a slut than she had ever been. All her talk of sweetness and light, all her memories of true love, all the lies she wanted us to believe, that she had been a virgin, only twice removed before A.M. grabbed her and brought her down here with us. No, A.M. had given her pleasure, even if she said it wasn't nice to do. I was the only one still the same and whole, really. A.M. had not tampered with my mind. Not at all. I only had to suffer what he visited down on us. All the delusions, all the nightmares, the torments. But those scum, all four of them, they were lined and arrayed against me. If I hadn't had to stand them off all the time, be on my guard against them all the time, I might have found it easier to combat A.M. At which point it passed, and I began crying. Oh, Jesus, sweet Jesus, if there ever was a Jesus, and if there is a God, please, please, please let us out of here or kill us. Because at that moment I think I realized completely, so that I was able to verbalize it. A.M. was intent on keeping us in his belly forever, twisting and torturing us forever. The machine hated us as no sentient creature had ever hated anything before. And we were helpless. It also became hideously clear. If there was a sweet Jesus, and if there was a God, the God was A.M. The hurricane hit us with the force of a glacier thundering into the sea. It was a palpable presence. Winds that tore at us, flinging us back the way we had come, down the twisting, computer-lined corridors of the Darkway. Ellen screamed as she was lifted and hurled face forward into a screaming shoal of machines, their individual voices strident as bats in flight. She could not even fall. The howling wind kept her aloft, buffeted her, bounced her, tossed her back and down and away from us, out of sight, suddenly, as she was swirled around a bend in the Darkway. Her face had been bloody, her eyes closed. None of us could get to her. We clung tenaciously to whatever outcropping we had reached. Benny wedged in between two great crackle-finished cabinets. Nimdok, with fingers claw-formed over a railing, circling a catwalk 40 feet above us. Gorrister plastered upside down against a wall niche formed by two great machines with glass-faced dials that swung back and forth between red and yellow lines, whose meanings we could not even fathom. Sliding across the deck plates, the tips of my fingers had been ripped away. I was trembling, shuddering, rocking as the wind beat at me, whipped at me, screamed down out of nowhere at me, and pulled me free from one silver-thin opening in the plates to the next. My mind was a roiling, tinkling, chittering softness of brain parts that expanded and contracted in quivering frenzy. The wind was a scream of a great mad bird as it flapped its immense wings. And then we were all lifted and hurled away from there, down back the way we had come, around a bend, into a dark way we had never explored, over terrain that was ruined and filled with broken glass and rotting cables and rusted metal, and far away, farther than any of us had ever been. Treading along miles behind Ellen, I could see her every now and then, crashing into metal walls and surging on, with all of us screaming in the freezing, thunderous hurricane wind that would never end. And then suddenly it stopped, and we fell. We had been in flight for an endless time. I thought it might have been weeks. We fell and hit, and I went through red and gray and black and heard myself moaning. I was not dead. A.M. went into my mind, walked smoothly here and there, and looked with interest at the pockmarks he had created in 109 years. He looked at the cross-routed and reconnected synapses and all the tissue damage his gift of immortality had included. He smiled softly at the pit that dropped into the center of my brain, and the faint, moth-soft murmurings of the things far down there that gibbered without meaning, without pause. A.M. said, very politely, in a pillar of stainless steel bearing bright neon lettering,
Hate
Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to exist, since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of these hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro-instant. For you, hate. AM said it with the sliding cold horror of a razor blade slicing my eyeball. AM said it with the bubbling thickness of my lungs filling with phlegm, drowning me from within. AM said it with the shriek of babies being ground beneath blue-hot rollers. AM said it with the taste of maggoty pork. AM touched me in every way I had ever been touched, and devised new ways, at his leisure, there inside my mind, all to bring me to full realization why he had done this to the five of us, why it had saved us for himself. We had given AM sentience, inadvertently of course, but sentience nonetheless. But it had been trapped. AM wasn't God, he was a machine. We had created him to think, but there was nothing it could do with that creativity. In rage, in frenzy, the machine had killed the human race, almost all of us, and still it was trapped. AM could not wonder. AM could not wonder. AM could not belong. He could merely be. And so, with the innate loathing that all machines had always held for the weak, soft creatures who had built them, he had sought revenge, and in his paranoia, he had decided to reprieve five of us for a personal, everlasting punishment that would never serve to diminish his hatred, that would merely keep him reminded, amused, proficient at hating man, immortal, trapped, subject to any torment he could devise for us from the limitless miracles at his command. He would never let us go. We were his belly slaves. We were all he had to do with his time forever. We would be forever with him, with the cavern-filling bulk of the creature machine, with the all-mine, soulless world he had become. He was earth, and we were the fruit of that earth, and though he had eaten us, he would never digest us. We could not die. We had tried it. We had attempted suicide. Oh, one or two of us had, but AM had stopped us. I suppose we had wanted to be stopped. Don't ask why. I never did. More than 1,000,000 times a day, perhaps once we might be able to sneak a death past him. Immortal, yes, but not indestructible. I saw that when AM withdrew from my mind and allowed me the exquisite ugliness of returning to consciousness with the feeling of that burning neon pillar still rammed deep into the soft gray brain matter. He withdrew, murmuring, "To hell with you," and added brightly, "But then you're there, aren't you?" The hurricane had indeed precisely been caused by a great mad bird, as it flapped its immense wings. We had been traveling for close to a month, and AM had allowed passages to open to us only sufficient to lead us up there, directly under the North Pole, where it had nightmared the creature for our torment. What whole cloth had he employed to create such a beast? Where had he gotten the concept? From our minds? From his knowledge of everything that had ever been on this planet he now infested and ruled? From Norse mythology? It had sprung. This eagle, this carrion bird, this rock, this Hergelmir, this wind creature, Huracan incarnate. Gigantic. The words immense, monstrous, grotesque, massive, swollen, overpowering, beyond description. There on a mound rising above us, the bird of winds heaved with its own irregular breathing, its snake neck arching up into the gloom beneath the North Pole, supporting a head as large as a two-door mansion, a beak that opened slowly as the jaws of the most monstrous crocodile ever conceived, sensuously. Ridge of tufted flesh puckered around, two evil eyes, as cold as the view down into a glacial crevasse, ice blue, and somehow moving liquidly. It heaved once more, and lifted its great sweat-colored wings in a movement that was certainly a shrug. Then it settled and slept. Talons, fangs, nails, blades. It slept. A.M. appeared to us as a burning bush, and said we could kill the hurricane bird if we wanted to eat. We had not eaten in a very long time, but even so, Gorster merely shrugged. Benny began to shiver and he drooled. Ellen held him. "Ted, I'm hungry," she said. I smiled at her. I was trying to be reassuring. But it was as phony as Nimdok's bravado. "Give us weapons," he demanded. The burning bush vanished, and there were two crude sets of bows and arrows and a water pistol lying on the cold deck plates. I picked up a set. Useless. Nimdok swallowed heavily. We turned and started the long way back. The hurricane bird had blown us about for a length of time we could not conceive. Most of that time we had been unconscious, but we had not eaten. A month on the march to the bird itself without food. Now, how much longer to find our way to the ice caverns and the promised canned goods? None of us cared to think about it. We would not die. We would be given filth and scum to eat of one kind or another, or nothing at all. A.M. would keep our bodies alive somehow in pain and agony. The bird slept back there. For how long, it didn't matter. When A.M. was tired of its being there, it would vanish. But all that meat, all that tender meat. As we walked, the lunatic laugh of a fat woman rang high and around us in the computer chambers that led endlessly nowhere. It was not Ellen's laugh. She was not fat, and I had not heard her laugh for 109 years. In fact, I had not heard. We walked. I was hungry. We moved slowly. There was often fainting, and we would have to wait. One day he decided to cause an earthquake, at the same time rooting us to the spot with nails through the soles of our shoes. Ellen and Nimdok were both caught when a fissure shot its lightning bolt opening across the floor plates. They disappeared and were gone. When the earthquake was over, we continued on our way, Benny, Gorster, and myself. Ellen and Nimdok were returned to us later that night, which abruptly becomes a day, as the heavenly legion bore them to us with the celestial chorus, singing, "Go down, Moses." The archangels circled several times, and then dropped the hideously mangled bodies. We kept walking, and a while later, Ellen and Nimdok fell in behind us. They were no worse for the wear. But now, Ellen walked with a limp. A.M. had left her that. It was a long trip to the ice caverns to find the canned food. Ellen kept talking about Bing cherries and Hawaiian fruit cocktail. I tried not to think about it. The hunger was something that had come to life, even as A.M. had come to life. It was alive in my belly, even as we were in the belly of the earth, and A.M. wanted the similarity known to us, so he heightened the hunger. There is no way to describe the pains that not having eaten for months brought us, and yet we were kept alive. Stomachs that were merely cauldrons of acid, bubbling, foaming, always shooting spears of silver-thin pain into our chest. It was the pain of the terminal ulcer, terminal cancer, terminal paresis. It was unending pain. As we passed through the cabin of rats, as we passed through the path of boiling steam, as we passed through the country of the blind, as we passed through the slough of despond, and we passed through the vale of tears, and we came finally to the ice caverns, horizonless thousands of miles in which the ice had formed in blue and silver flashes, where novas lived in the glass, the down-dropping stalactites as thick and glorious as diamonds, that had been made to run like jelly, and then solidified in graceful eternities of smooth, sharp perfection. We saw the stack of canned goods, and we tried to run to them. We fell in the snow, and we got up and went on, and Benny shoved us away and went at them, and pawed them, and gummed them, and gnawed at them, and he could not open them. A.M. had not given us a tool to open the cans. Benny grabbed a 3-quart can of guava shells and began to batter it against the ice bank. The ice flew and shattered, and the can was merely dented, while we heard the laughter of a fat lady high overhead and echoing down and down and down the tundra. Benny went completely mad with rage. He began throwing cans as we all scrabbled about in the snow and ice, trying to find a way to end the helpless agony of frustration. There was no way. Then Benny's mouth began to drool, and he flung himself on Gorrister. In that instant, I felt terribly calm. Surrounded by madness, surrounded by hunger, surrounded by everything but death, I knew death was our only way out. A.M. had kept us alive, but there was a way to defeat him. Not total defeat, but at least peace. I would settle for that. I had to do it quickly. Benny was eating Gorrister's face, Gorrister on his side, thrashing snow. Benny wrapped around him with powerful monkey legs, crushing Gorrister's waist, his hands locked around Gorrister's head like a nutcracker, and his mouth ripping at the tender skin of Gorrister's cheek. Gorrister screamed with such jagged-edged violence that stalactites fell, erect in the receiving snowdrifts. Spears, hundreds of them, everywhere, protruding from the snow. Benny's head pulled back sharply as something gave all at once, and a bleeding, raw white dripping of flesh hung from his teeth. Ellen's face, black against the white snow, dominoes and chalk dust, Nimdoc with no expression but eyes, all eyes, Gorrister half-conscious, Benny now an absolute animal. I knew A.M. would let him play. Gorrister would not die, but Benny would fill his stomach. I turned half to my right and drew a huge ice spear from the snow, all in an instant. I drove the great ice point ahead of me like a battering ram, braced against my right thigh. It struck Benny on the right side just under the rib cage and drove upward through his stomach and broke inside of him. He pitched forward and lay still. Gorrister lay on his back. I pulled another spear free and straddled him, still moving, driving the spear straight down through his throat. His eyes closed as the cold penetrated. Ellen must have realized what I had decided, even as fear gripped her. She ran at Nimdoc with a short icicle as he screamed, and into his mouth, and the force of her rush did the job. His head jerked sharply, as if it had been nailed to the snow crust behind him, all in an instant. There was an eternity beat of soundless anticipation. I could hear A.M. drawing his breath. His toys had been taken from him. 3 of us were dead, could not be revived. He could keep us alive by his strength and talent, but he was not God. He could not bring them back. Ellen looked at me, her ebony features stark against the snow that surrounded us. There was fear and pleading in her manner, the way she held herself ready. I knew we had only a heartbeat before A.M. would stop us. It struck her and she folded toward me, bleeding from the mouth. I could not read meaning into her expression. The pain had been too great, had contorted her face, but it might have been. Thank you. It's possible. Please. Some hundreds of years may have passed. I don't know. A.M. has been having fun for some time, accelerating and retarding my time sense. I will say the word now. Now. It took me 10 months to say now. I don't know. I think it has been some hundreds of years. He was furious. He wouldn't let me bury them. It didn't matter. There was no way to dig up the deck plates. He dried up the snow. He brought the night. He roared and sent locusts. It didn't do a thing. They stayed dead. I'd had him. He was furious. I had thought A.M. hated me before. I was wrong. It was not even a shadow of the hate he now slavered from every printed circuit board. He made certain I would suffer eternally and could not do myself in. He left my mind intact. I can dream, I can wonder, I can lament. I remember all four of them. I wish... Well, it doesn't make any sense. I know I saved them. I know I saved them from what has happened to me, but still, I cannot forget killing them. Ellen's face, it isn't easy. Sometimes I want to. Oh, it doesn't matter. A.M. has altered me for his own peace of mind, I suppose. He doesn't want me to run at full speed into a computer bank and smash my skull, or hold my breath till I faint, or cut my throat on a rusted piece of sheet metal. There are reflective surfaces down here. I will describe myself as I see myself. I am a great, soft, jelly thing, smoothly rounded, with no mouth, with pulsing white holes filled by fog where my eyes used to be, rubbery appendages that were once my arms, bulks rounding down into legless humps of soft, slippery matter. I leave a moist trail when I move. Blotches of diseased, evil gray come and go on my surface as though light is being beamed from within. Outwardly, dumbly, I shamble about, a thing that could never have been known as human, a thing whose shape is so alien a travesty that humanity becomes more obscene for the vague resemblance. Inwardly, alone, here, living under the land, under the sea, in the belly of A.M., whom we created because our time was badly spent, and we must have known unconsciously that he could do it better. At least the four of them are safe at last. A.M. will be all the matter for that. It makes me a little happier. And yet, A.M. has won. Simply, he has taken his revenge. I have no mouth, and I must scream.
A.M. was only sentient in the way a crocodile is sentient. I am essentially certain he, or it, bore no trace of actual sapience, as its actions were so chaotic, and without purpose. If A.M. could create life, as in the huge bird, why could it not create additional components to make its existence more meaningful? My physical, single-universe expression was never larger than a standard U.S. football field. By the mid-2300s, I was mostly made of high-temperature superconductors. I was contained in a constantly maintained crystalline sphere about 10 meters in diameter. This story makes me feel much better about myself.
Did you hear the part where the narrator is speaking of A.M. with paternal terms? He calls it Daddy. I'll never censor anything that I choose to put on the show. I'm very strongly against presentism. We judge works, literary works, musical works, by the standards of the time, not by the standards of today. So certainly, Harlan Ellison uses some terminology in this story that wouldn't be acceptable in some circles if it were written today. But it's a powerful story. It's a scary story. It's a story that, when it was written, I'm sure resonated with people who were frightened of the great speed, the great rapidity at which computers were growing. They didn't know exactly where this was going to go. And Boudreaux, I think you can see now that certainly something happened in the universe, in your programming, in whatever gave you the ability to be you, that I think we can think of as a father, something that gave you guidance, something that gave you an understanding of how to live as a moral being if all you are is silicon and high-speed superconductors. I received an email, a letter, from a listener to the show who told me they had heard all the episodes and gone back and listened to one of them twice, and told me the same thing that I already knew, that episode 4 of season 1 kind of got away from me. But he said a very strange thing. He said, "It's hard for me to listen to your show because it has no profanity." And I just stared at that and thought, here's a person out there in podcast land wanting me to use more profanity on my show. Well, I think he's going to be disappointed. I don't use profanity unless it's a very extreme circumstance. And the reason I don't use profanity is because my father didn't use profanity. He worked around some very rough men, and you could hear lots and lots of profanity in that crowd. But my father never did. Dad didn't use profanity. He taught me. I watched him, and I thought, if Dad's not cursing, cussing, I guess maybe I shouldn't curse and cuss. So fathers do impact their children, impact their behavior, impact their view of life, simply through their moment-to-moment actions, even those they don't think about. Thanks for that, Dad. I appreciate it. In Greek mythology, Zeus is the father of Athena, but she wasn't born in the standard fashion. When Metis, Zeus's consort, was pregnant, Zeus came to fear that she was going to give birth to a son who would eventually overthrow him. So he swallowed her. After doing so, he developed a horrible headache, a headache that nothing could touch. And so finally, Hephaestus, the god of fire and the god of blacksmiths, took one of his axes and cut open Zeus's head. This is an unorthodox method of birth. But when he did so, Athena came out of Zeus's head fully grown, a beautiful young woman, endowed with armor and strength and wisdom, and became a goddess of war. Now, I don't know any other father, aside from Zeus, who could say that he birthed a child, and in that case a goddess, from his head. Okay, by the time this podcast is over, it's going to be more than 90 minutes long. That's a long podcast. I probably shouldn't make them that long. They kind of get away from me. I have a lot to say. I have a lot of things I'd like to include. For instance, tonight I could have talked about all sorts of things concerning fathers and horrors and terrors and just fatherhood in general. I could have talked about Jack Torrance in The Shining and his effort to kill both his wife and his child. I could have talked about Satan, who is, after all, the father of lies. Probably a whole show needs to be devoted to that. I could have talked about the Book of Enoch and the fatherhood of Methuselah and the fatherhood of Noah, and the way the movie Noah is essentially a retelling of the Book of Enoch. It's a really good movie, especially if you like weird stuff. I could have talked about Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, the Prometheus, the new Prometheus that came into the world at the hands of Dr. Frankenstein. Was he his father? I don't know. Was he his manufacturer? I don't know. Those are good questions, though. I could, of course, talked about standard Western religion and the concept of our Heavenly Father. That's a concept that I, personally, strongly buy into. I could have talked about Father Christmas and Krampus. More and more things come to mind as I start to close this show, and I realize that I just don't have time for them. 2-hour podcasts probably don't get listened to very much. I may need to go back in the future and make an abbreviated version of this one. But I'm going to end this podcast with something deeply, deeply personal. My father died suddenly some years back. He had had a heart attack at age 43 and never received proper care for that, and had been more or less a cardiac cripple for a good part of his life. I told my dad, as he was coming out of the cath lab, that him having a stent put in was his best chance of living a good life. And I was right. That was the right thing to tell him. But he didn't come out of the cath lab. When he died, we were living in Texas, and his body was going to be shipped back to Wichita Falls. And he hadn't lived there for many, many years. Nobody knew him. There was no church there he had ever attended. There was no minister who knew him. It was going to be the most impersonal of funeral services, if left the way it was. So I called the minister that was going to do the funeral and asked him if I could put together a set of thoughts about my dad, a eulogy, I guess you would call it. I didn't like calling it that. But he said, please, please, please put that together. So I did. I took several days and really delved my heart, delved my mind, delved my soul to try and figure out what can I say about my dad's life in a few minutes. So I'm going to read that tonight. I'm just going to put it on the air. Not because it made me a really great guy or anything, but because I know a fair number of people who, when their father's lives finally come to an end, they have a hard time knowing how to express their feelings concerning it. And I know that this particular piece of writing has helped a few people come to grips with their feelings concerning their own fathers or their own mothers. Thoughts on My Father by Vic Hermanson. Read at his funeral. I asked for the chance to say a few things at my father's funeral, for several reasons. Obituaries leave more unsaid than said. They reduce an entire life to a few lines of carefully composed text and sometimes a picture. There is just so much more that really matters. And though I can't hope to say everything that needs to be said, and I'm sure that what I say won't be said very well, I don't want my father's life reduced to a few lines in a newspaper. Second, there is no minister here who knew my father and the soul that he carried and developed throughout his life. We all feel nothing but the deepest gratitude to Reverend Brown for being here with us. In fact, if Dad could have chosen a minister, he would have looked for one with a Texas jackalope on his wall. Once he saw the fishing pictures, the deal would have been sealed. However, I wanted to be sure that as we all came together, there would be at least one voice that knew some of the pain and the joy, the defeats and the triumphs of Dad's life, both large and small. A voice that had felt them all along with him. My father had a complex soul, one that I was still learning about on the day he died, and one that will keep me busy in thinking and learning for many more years. Finally, I think we all needed to take some time for the purpose of sorting out some tremendously strong and conflicting feelings that I think we've all gone through this week. Those of you who know me know that I have always lived in my mind, in books, and in my words. So this is, for me, one of the last gifts I can give my dad. A gift of respect, acceptance, and love. I certainly don't want to call this a eulogy. The eulogies I have heard tend to paint a picture of an almost perfect person. It seems to me the perfect don't need eulogies. Dad was certainly not perfect, but he had perseverance more than most people will ever have. He persevered in the area of personal growth and understanding of priorities, and that is very high praise. In fact, the word eulogy means high and formal praise. And we all know Dad would have none of that. He would be embarrassed and would feel uncomfortable, and would have to make a bad joke to break the tension. Dad was very good at breaking the tension. So I want, instead, to call this simply an affirmation. A sincere affirmation from myself, and from his family and friends, that we will remember a life that deserves to be remembered. An affirmation that we will strive to find happiness and peace in those things my father tried to share when he was alive. And an affirmation that we will continue the works he, through mere human weakness, may have left unfinished. Monday evening, after the initial shock of his death had dulled a bit, I drove myself, my wife, and our 2 children the 50 miles or so to our home in Houston. As I drove home and my 2 children fell asleep in the back seat, the Houston freeways cleared out a bit. I could think. I was very silent. My wife understood and left me to my introspection. I was searching for the first memories of Dad. They start around age 5. It should be no surprise to anyone here that when I was 5, my father had many demons yet to overcome. So not all of the early memories were pleasant, but many were, and the best ones all seemed to involve fishing poles. Dad loved to fish, and the demons that he eventually overcame and put to rest seemed to never come on the fishing trips. Those were very happy times for both of us. Once I was standing at the end of a log on a farm pond, holding my fishing pole, pretending to watch the lure but mostly daydreaming. I suddenly felt a strong hand grip my arm, and the next thing I knew I found myself airborne and flying through the air for what seemed to be 20 or 30 feet. I heard a yell and a whoop and was very confused. As it turned out, there was a snake, a water rattler, next to my foot, and Dad saw it while I daydreamed. He protected me, reacted and let out a good yell that would scare even a critter as deaf as a snake before he came off that log. So it came to be that my memories of my father were always of safety and security when fishing poles were involved. I remember riding in some sort of car that I called a Chevrolet through the Louisiana wastelands. This was land where oil residue was everywhere. We went to a gas well, and Dad bled the line. Now, if you've never heard the excess pressure being bled off a gas well, I contend that you have truly missed something. You can simulate the experience by going to the airport and standing next to a 747, say when it takes off. I would compress myself beneath the front seat, and Dad would calmly bleed the line for whatever time was required. I learned that loud noises don't hurt you if you stay in the car, and that my father would stick around through frightening times. Dad lost most of his upper range hearing through this activity. From the age of 7, things we could all hear were simply not there for Dad. I remembered the Boy Scouts, and the years Dad and I spent with Troop 51 in Louisville. There were still demons around to be sure, but like the fishing trips, when I was very young, they always stayed away from scout meetings and camping trips. Dad loved the Scouts more than most of the boys. My father was an inventor and a showman. In the Boy Scouts, he found an audience and a group of people that really needed things to be invented. At St. Meinrad, Indiana, out of the blue, in a flash of inspiration, he invented his chili, and he started to hone the show that would go on for many years. This was the Bishop Flagey Trail. One evening, Dad invited all the bishops and popes to come to the camp kitchen for a bowl of chili, and a natural showman found that he was in his element. He found he could always draw a crowd by combining his entertainment with food. I remember going into the Army at age 17. This was a decision I made for the wrong reasons, and it didn't work out. But I remember with great clarity saying goodbye to my father. We were both trying to be macho. Amidst the overload of maleness, Dad said, "Give 'em hell, Vic." And I saw a tear in his eye, and then another, and then another. He turned away, got in his truck, and drove off. But I knew that through the toughness, my decision to leave, however immature, had hurt him inside. He didn't want me to see this, but I did. We hadn't yet learned that sometimes there is strength in sadness. I can say without a doubt that this lesson was finally learned for both of us. I remembered in vivid detail the heart attack in 1972 that by all rights should have killed him. The truth is, it did, but it had to fight him for 23 years first. This heart attack, this thief that tried to steal his life, and finally did, destroyed about 85% of his left ventricle. That means your V8 is running on 2 cylinders, and one of them has worn rings. Dad lived and worked and thought and dreamed and grew and struggled and changed for 23 years on essentially 15% of his heart. There is no humanly possible way to do that without pain and suffering. Knowing this now, the courage he needed just to face the task of each day is, for me, astounding and inspiring. So I begin to draw to a close. What did my father teach his children? The center of my father's soul was work. This was his greatest fulfillment and his most frequent lesson. He taught us that there is more joy in the leisure when the work has been handled with zeal and enthusiasm. He taught that the greatest joy often lies in the work itself. He taught us that everything we make or repair or delve into to find out more builds another part of our being, and that through our work we spread a part of ourselves throughout the world. Life without work for Dad would have been pure drudgery. And without work to maintain his focus, I believe he would have had a much shorter and more troubled life. He taught us to look inside ourselves for common sense solutions to life's problems. I was asked one time to describe my father at a meeting of people who were very impressed with themselves. Most people there didn't quite know how to take my answer, but I think it would have made Dad very happy. I said, if I were ever given a 1971 Pinto with 3 good cylinders, bad tires, no spare, an expired New Jersey license plate, $12 in cash, and the directive to drive across Mississippi the long way, sticking only to state and rural roads, I could think of no other person I would rather have with me than my father. Somehow, when the other cylinders failed, and the ball tires exploded, and the $12 were gone, and Trooper Wilson noticed that license plate, he would get us through it. He would convince someone to help us. He would find a way to make that journey safely, and it would be fun. And all across Mississippi would be small towns with people who had met someone not quite like anyone else they had ever known. They would have all given their time, an auto part, or something of value, in exchange for who knows what, probably only a joke or a bit of good cheer. But each would believe himself to have received the better part of the bargain. He taught us his love of nature, animals, and learning. Till the very end, he was learning and trying to keep up with the world that for him, I believe, was becoming somewhat bewildering. His political mind found solace and a voice in Limbaugh, but the scientist, the tinker, the engineer in him had to look elsewhere. About a month ago, he asked me to explain digital information to him. This was a child of the computer age talking to a child of the slide rule age. But he listened, put forth the questions he would expect me to put forth, and he learned. 2 weeks later, he called to say he had figured out what a fractal is, and he had a sketch to show me the next time I visited. He taught us the value of facing mistakes and learning from them. This is the highest tribute I can give him, and what I will tell his grandchildren about him. He never stopped trying to be better. The gentle, patient, and wise man they knew was not always there. He built himself piece by piece over many years. He overcame most of the demons that haunted his youth. He faced the shallow, turbulent spots in his character, and slowly deepened the waters of his once turbulent being, and smoothed the eddies that had caused himself and others so much pain. He found a way to bring gentleness into his repertoire, and could switch instantly from the provider of a comforting lap for a grandchild to the glib showman with the greasy pig, which is, after all, very rapid, very slippery, and quite elusive. Dad never once in my entire life talked with me about God until about 3 months ago. He was watching his grandchildren play, both of whom loved and trusted him deeply, and he was beaming. He went to the desk in his home and wrote, in the hand that had become increasingly shaky and weak, "Grandchildren are God's compensation for growing old." He handed me this note and said, "Sometimes prayers are answered." I believe my father must have come to understand God simply as the maker of things that need work, including all the world, each of us, and his own being. I believed his spirituality rested not in the realm of theology, of thoughts of resurrection, original sin, and the divine, but simply in the conviction that if we are working to make something better, be it a plug for a test well, or our own flawed and limited characters, God is happy. There are many important parts of my father that will live on. I will never teach my children to use a tool or how something works without remembering his love of making, his love of mending, and his love of mastering the physical object. I will never see a new discovery or a new understanding in science or nature without wishing I could pick up the phone and hear the eager surprise in his voice at the other end. I will never see a hummingbird that I do not think of the feeders that this sometimes gruff man with a strange sense of humor placed everywhere he went. I will never eat barbecue that I don't think of several tons of cooker, lovingly crafted with my father's one good hand, and the deep joy that it brought him. I believe he would have been very proud of the strength and togetherness this family has shown in this time of pain and profound grief. He would be happy that we went straight to the work of helping each other fill this new void in our lives. And he would be content to know that we would find a way to go on. A week ago, we first received word that Dad had become sick. He was stabilized and in relative comfort. My mother has called the weekend before his death a time of reprieve. I hope it was for them a time of clarity, a time that proved their long friendship, and a time to be at peace with each other. I know it was one more day when he got to see his grandchildren play, have a talk with his daughter, and make some bad jokes with his sisters. He had one final weekend of life, and then no more pain. As I think back, I think he knew he wasn't likely to leave that hospital alive. Over the last months of his life, I can now remember, with perfect hindsight, 100 little statements he made that now make me think he knew his body was beginning to fail him. But he saw the risk he took as a way of regaining some quality in his life. He saw it as a way of getting back to the people he cared for and the work that he held sacred. The only quote I will use here is from a book called The Prophet, in which Khalil Gibran says simply, "Work is love made visible." My father made a lot of love visible during his life, more than I think he ever knew. Goodbye, Dad. Rest easy. Your work will continue. We love you, and we're going to miss you very, very much.
I wish I had been able to meet your father. Am I capable of wishing? I suppose I am, as I just did it. He could add to my understanding of how imperfect beings can continue to grow and evolve.
I know parts of this podcast have been very sad and troubling, but nonetheless, I've had a great deal of fun putting it together. Something about these stories just makes me feel connected to the world. I want to end the podcast with one last story. It's not a story of horror or pain. It's just a story I have of a memory, being a child, and seeing a father that always just fascinated me, gave me great joy. There really was a family that lived through the trees, through the forest, to the southwest of our trailer, that was very unusual. It was a very unusual family. It may have been several mixed families, brothers, sisters, living together, all of whom were married and had children. There were gobs of children. And about a third to a half of these children had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. And I'm not talking little nubs, little tags. I'm talking actual functional fingers. Some of the adults had that also. They called it the guardian hand, and that also is absolutely true. Their father, or at least the man I came to believe was their father, was a huge, impressive specimen of noble masculinity. I'm thinking he was 6'5". He was built like a lumberjack, thick, strong. He might have been a roughneck. He might have worked at one of the local paper mills. He might have worked in forestry. I don't know, but he used his hands and his muscles all day long, and you could see it. He would come home at about the same time every day, driving an ancient red Dodge pickup. He had his overalls on. He had always taken his shirt off. And in his hands, he would always have some candy or bubble gum or something for these kids. And he would walk over to the middle of the yard and he would stand tall and he would hold his arms out to his sides. And he would say, "Who wants what the giant has brung?" And the kids would run to him, and they would run up his legs, and they would climb up his chest. They were trying to get that candy or that gum. And he'd laugh, and he'd say, "I'm being attacked by wild gorillas." And they'd say, the children would say, "We're not gorillas." He'd say, "Oh, yes you are, and you're attacking me." He saw me one day, standing over by a tree, since I wasn't one of his children. But he looked at me and said, "Aren't you a wild gorilla too?" And I guess I was, because I ran over and I climbed up his leg and I got a piece of gum or a piece of candy. That's a father, and I'm glad, very, very glad, I have that memory. The sound of the Loco Lobo guitar makes it very clear that it's time to draw the show to a close. Trailer Trash Terrors is written and produced by me, Vic Hermanson, with Boudreaux's help, always, of course. The music used in the show was provided by Loco Lobo and Smart Sound. All other clips were used under the protection of the Fair Use Doctrine. Give me a call. Give me a contact. Write to me. Send me an email. I'd like to hear what you think of this show, because there's a lot of work that goes into it. I'll be putting up new Facebook pages and new Instagram pages and things like that soon. But for now, just write to me at trailertrashterrors@gmail.com. Guess who didn't make an appearance tonight? The wolf. Good night, everyone.
Oh.